Welcome to the 10th annual Martin Gardner Celebration of Mind and the first annual virtual presentation of Celebration of Mind. Obviously, unfortunately brought to us because of COVID-19. But it's also fortunate that people like me who normally cannot get there can participate in this week of presentations. So we're very happy that people who are remote can participate remotely. The speaker this session is Jim Gardner, who will be sharing with us. The title is The Whimsical and Serious Side of Martin Gardner. As the eldest son of Martin Gardner, he'll share some of his memories and anecdotes and hopefully give us some insight into Martin's approach to life and work in general. Jim's current focus is on keeping alive Martin Gardner's legacy. However, he's accomplished in his own right as a Professor Emeritus from the University of Oklahoma, specializing in universal design for learning, with attention to instructional assistive technologies for students with disabilities and learners at risk for school failure. So let me turn it over to Jim at this point.
Hi, Fred, and thank you so much for a very warm introduction. And welcome everyone to my talk today, sharing just some personal thoughts of what it was like growing up with having Martin Gardner as your father. And I often begin by saying, you know, from my perspective, Martin Gardner was just another dad. It was not like we were having seminars every night over dinner, and we were talking about the philosophy of science and other deep factors and elements that he was interested in. He pretty much let me go off and do my sorts of things, but certainly having a dad in the house strongly influenced some of the ways that I look on life, and also gave me opportunities to touch upon a variety of topics that maybe were not traditional in other families. So I'm going to kind of give you the whimsical side, the serious side of Dad, share some anecdotes, and I'll close with some of my favorite photos, and then we can talk a little bit. So I guess I'll start off with the serious side. I'll probably end up speaking less about that and more in the whimsical and just the other elements. But certainly, believe it or not, yes, the world's most skeptical man was my father, Martin Gardner. And in fact, probably if I was to say the one thing that Dad instilled, the one thing that I deeply respect for having grown up with Martin Gardner as my father was the honor in being able to say, I clearly am a skeptic. So of course, Dad is well known for his fads and fallacies in the name of science, where he really debunked a variety of pseudoscience and strange and quirky theories. He went on to expand science, good, bad, and bogus. And certainly if you were to think about skepticism, all of these are things that Dad instilled on me that I either learned directly or was able to observe indirectly. I often like to tell the story, I'd say it was about 15 years ago or so. I was picking up a prescription in one of the local pharmacies of a national chain, and sitting on the counter where you picked up your prescription from them was, this is not the actual thing, but were a series of these magnetic ID bracelets, which were promoted to help cure different type ails and other elements. And it immediately turned me off. And over a series of talking to the manager and eventually having to talk to someone at the National Pharmacy, I got through to them that I thought it was extremely inappropriate for having something that had no scientific background sitting there where you were picking up scientifically based medicines and other things. So having to go to these extremes to sometimes fight for skepticism and other things certainly is in my DNA. You know, indirectly, I could say that in many times I was able to hear either from Dad speaking directly, or we would have guests over and I would hear background discussion that certainly there were a lot of charlatans that Dad had very little respect for. And I just kind of put together a list of those. Many of them you may recognize. Ted Sirios, who for a period of time in the 60s, I remember a fairly ongoing discussion with Dad and some of his magic friends regarding, I think it was Ted Sirios was from Chicago and was taking thought graphs of his mind using a Polaroid camera. Of course, there was a gizmo and a gimmick to it. And Dad and James Randi and I think Percy Diaconis were behind finally showing to the world that that these thought graphs were not true. The second name I think we'd notice, Dad certainly wrote about Dianetics, infads and fallacies. Peter Popoff, the preacher who actually had people in the audience, or I think it was his wife behind the scenes, who was connected to a microphone. Popoff had a wireless earpiece, and his wife would feed them information about the audience, where Popoff would certainly, through clairvoyance or other things, be able to repeat things about the individual that certainly they had not shared with Popoff, thinking he was amazing. Uri Geller bending spoons, and certainly in the latter parts of his year, he did not have respect for Doc Oz, certainly because, in his opinion, Oz promoted homeopathy, among other things. And of course, for Dad, especially with homeopathy, there is absolutely zero scientific base to that. So in the background, these were often things that I recollect Dad talking about, either with friends, overhearing him on the phone, or possibly also talking one-on-one. Dad also had some champions, and I think these are the more positive ones. Dad certainly enjoyed the empirical nature of scientists and the fact that magicians, when they were doing magic, never really tried to present the fact that magic was really magic, but that they were performing. Magicians certainly would not share the secrets to their magic, but Dad was probably most comfortable, I think, when he was in a room with magicians, sharing different secrets and different elements from the hobby and the field of magic. Dad was a member of a group, Trapdoor Spiders. This was a group of authors and other individuals from a variety of backgrounds, skeptics, scientists, Isaac Asimov Lester Del Rey, James Randi, Stephen Canfor. All of these individuals would meet a few times a year for drinks and dinner to share just a variety of different thoughts. Dad enjoyed Johnny Carson because Carson was a magician. And when Uri Geller tried to demonstrate his psychic spoon bending, Carson ensured that Geller was not able to plant anything and or get to the materials to pre-construct them in a way that would make it look like Geller was really bending the spoons. Very strong thoughts for Percy Diaconis, the Stanford mathematician and magician, for Penn and Teller, for the fact that they took over the reins of debunking with their television show for many years, Bullshit. Dad and Teller communicated for many years. Interestingly, they never met face to face, but they talked on the phone. They talked via mail and other elements. And then finally, his closest friend, and that was James Randi. Dad and Randy, over the years, had an extremely strong bond, and certainly would share their most inner thoughts, concerns, possible theories to why some individuals who were presenting certain psychic skills or other elements that they knew to be untrue, to be false. They were very, very close in a lot of ways. And I happen to just have a couple photos that I thought I'd share with you. This was taken probably maybe around 1995 to the year 2000, well, or maybe 2000, sometime between 2000 and 2010, I think. And Dad had already moved to Norman, Oklahoma. Here's another one with Randy and the magician Jamie Ian Swift with some background illustrations, the cover of one of Dad's previous annotated Alice books, and then I think an illustration for something that was in a column that Dad published in Omni magazine. I may not be certain about that. And then on the bookcase, every single book in there is a copy of one of Dad's books. Dad had a daily routine that I remember growing up. And I found this so interesting because this was essentially the routine that he followed Monday through Sunday. Certainly he might take part of the day off with my mother. They would drive out to go. My mom would go look at antiques and Dad would follow along and go to a bookstore. But I remember he would wake up for breakfast and always had the New York Times to read. He would go then after breakfast upstairs to the third floor of our house on 10 Euclid Avenue in Hastings and Hudson. The entire third floor was his domain. He had his office and bookcases in there. He had another second room that was his library, more books. And then we had a couple of little storage areas that had more books or more things in there. He'd work until about 1. He'd come down. Mom would make him lunch. It was a short lunch. Dad would go back up to work till 4 o'clock sharp. That was cocktail hour. He'd come down, have cocktails with Mom. And I think the afternoon paper it was either I can't remember, the Herald Statesman or the Herald Tribune, that Dad only subscribed to just because they had a cryptogram. And so Dad's favorite thing to pass a little bit of time over cocktails was to do the daily cryptogram. He'd go back upstairs to work until dinner. He'd come back down to dinner, go back up and work, and then was usually in bed, where he would be reading and or editing drafts of things that he had written, or looking at proofs for his book and editing. And pretty much he did that same cycle, I think, day in and day out. I often say, people at some point ask, well, Dad certainly must have used word processing in the last few years of his life. Well, this is actually Dad's use of technology. So yes, Dad did do word processing. However, his word processing was, he used the typewriter, and then what he would do is he would either hand correct what he typed in the typewriter, or if in fact there were some major revisions or other things, he would then cut out the paragraph that he didn't want to use. And then he would take the other paragraphs, repaste them onto a sheet of paper using rubber cement, and then he would retype the paragraph and insert that in. So Dad never ever worked using a word processor. In fact, the big technology jump I remember doing was sometime in 1970, where Dad went from a manual typewriter to an electrical typewriter. Dad never used a touch-tone phone throughout his life. All his phone calls were made using a dial phone, which he often said he found it somewhat frustrating. He'd call to a pharmacy or someplace, and they would say, enter your phone number, or touch 1 or touch 2 for this. He might get a call. Couldn't do that with a rotary phone, but that's what he used. And then Dad balanced his checkbook using this form of a calculator. He often used an abacus. He did have a calculator, but my fond memories are coming up into his office, and he would be using the abacus to go ahead and balance his checkbook or do other things. So moving in a little more to the whimsical side of Dad. Here are 2 photographs of what I find really are fun because they're whimsical. The one on the left is a caricature of Ken Fallon, and that came with a, I believe, let's see, the might have been, wasn't the Washington Post. I think it was, well, I think it was the Wall Street Journal. And it was a article about Dad. Robert Crease, who was one of our speakers a few days ago, in fact, was the author of that article. And I happened to just fall in love with this artwork to the degree that I contacted the paper and asked to get a contact information for Ken Fallon. And Ken very generously allowed me to purchase this at a very reasonable price. And so now I have that framed on the wall. But what I think is interesting is Fallon, who only worked off of photographs of Dad. I find it very interesting to see Dad's self-caricature of himself in this card that I found that he wrote for my mother on their 78th anniversary how they're very close to one another. So Dad's self-perception of himself, I think, rather whimsically, is very close to Ken Fallon's. You know, Dad, Dad in consultation and conjunction with his friend Dr. Matrix, of course, reported that Dr. Matrix predicted many years before that the millionth digit of pi would be 5. And now I can share with you that, in fact, when Dr. Matrix and Dad talked, they actually decided that they would just randomly pick a number and see how that would work. And I think it's rather interesting and whimsical that Dad hit on that particular number with Dr. Matrix. Dad had some abstract art in the house. Well, many people may know that Dad, in his Scientific American column, introduced the artwork of M.C. Escher. And in fact, we're looking at a copy, not a great one, of the Escher print that Dad actually purchased directly from Escher during their correspondence while Dad was preparing to write the column on Escher. And I find it rather interesting that at the time, the art editor of Scientific American did not think that Escher was an artist and asked Dad just kind of indirectly, he said, "So tell me, how much did you pay for the Escher print?" And I think, and this is in $1960. I think it was around $150 or $175. And the art director said, "Oh, you paid too much." Well, we all know how famous Escher is today, so I actually think that it was a rather good purchase, and it is my favorite piece of art that came from Dad. Now, there was some other art that Dad posted in our house at one point. This is not the original piece of art, but apparently when I was very young, and I don't remember if it was our house in Dobbs Ferry, New York on Bel Air Drive, or it was by the time we moved down to 10 Euclid Avenue in Hastings and Hudson. My dad framed a rather abstract art print. And he said on more than one occasion, they'd be walking up to his office. On Dobbs Ferry, it was on the 2nd floor. In Hastings on Hudson, it was on the 3rd floor. Someone would stop and remark and say, "Oh, that's a very interesting piece of art." And Dad would say, yes, it is. I happen to have gotten it directly from the artist, and I have posted it there because I too find it rather unique and interesting. And what he would not tell them was it was one of my kindergarten or preschool finger paintings, but Dad just had a little bit of humor in posting that. And of course, Dad's April 1975 Scientific American column was one of his most whimsical sort of things, where he predicted 5 or 6 predictions, one of which was that Leonardo da Vinci actually invented the flush toilet, or the valve flush toilet. He also had something that was a psychic power engine. You would cut out this piece of paper, fold up some edges, put it on a pin, and then start looking at it, and eventually it would start turning. Well, all of these things were just April Fool's jokes. And I remember coming back from college in the spring, and I was upstairs talking with Dad in his office, and he brought up the column and he pointed to me one area in his office where there were stacks of papers, and there must have easily been over 1,000 or so different forms of letters. And he said, and I've grouped these into three sets. One set are people who were bamboozled by me in my Scientific American column and wrote to Scientific American saying I absolutely should be fired. Then there was another group that wrote to me that said that while they agreed with certain elements of the column, they thought that specific ones were actually not factual, and they wanted to let Martin Gardner know. And then finally, there was another stack of readers who just said they just thought the whole thing was a stitch, and they were very happy that Scientific American would go to the degree of actually being willing to print a prank. Dad also liked allusions with common everyday objects and or things that were in different places. And so it happened, here's one that Dad often kept, he kept this on his desk, and inside was a piece of paper. And this is, I think it's called a highball glass. And I did a little video of this illusion. I'll kind of narrate. So here's our glass, and here's the paper. And we can see that we stretch out the paper and we move it from the base of the glass, and it's actually taller than the particular glass. However, when you take that piece of paper and you roll it around the circumference of the top mouthpiece of the glass, you find it is actually equal to the circumference. And Dad always marveled at that illusion because it was one you could show almost anyone, and they would just find that amazing. So that was one of Dad's whimsical illusions, or at least I thought. Now, I happened to be talking to my magician friend, Mark Mitten, and coming from that, Mark said, well, you know, I can let me create some videos of some of these illusions that you were talking about, because often I would be walking when I was younger. I might be going up to talk to Dad in his office, or after Dad moved back to Norman, Oklahoma, I would typically go out and visit him on Sundays. I would come into his apartment, and Dad would be standing up practicing tricks like these, just if he needed to kill a little time. So this first one is the rope penetration. So Mark's going to show it a little slower. How that works. And that was one of Dad's favorite whimsical little rope tricks that he liked to show off to individuals. Here's a second one, and it has to do with the ring and the chain that we'll see. So obviously, it drops down through the chain. Let's do it again. Oh, but this time it's captured. So let's look at how that occurs to get a sense of what happens. So now Mark is going to show how the way in which you drop the ring has an effect on whether or not it's captured. And so what Mark went ahead and did was he even went one step farther to show you what physically occurs with the ring. So somehow it flips, and that is in fact what captures it. And then finally, Dad often liked to show, this is one of the earliest tricks that he showed me. This, I am pretty sure I came down to the table one morning for breakfast or for lunch, and Dad had set up these glasses. Now, as I understand it, I think the bar bet goes something along the lines of, you have 3 glasses, and I'm going to show you how in 3 steps, turning over 2 glasses at a time, I can end up with 3 glasses open, and that means you would buy me 3 drinks. I get the 3 drinks. Now, what you don't know though, if you notice the middle one was up, and it's like that. So the secret is you turn over that one so it's down, and you say, all right, I'd like you to go ahead and try and do it. So we're going to look at that one. 1, 2. You can't do it. You can't see, and you get, so you can go back if you turn it over, and then you can finally do it. So here is in fact the element. So if you notice it's up, you want to get the 3 up, but then you turn the center one so it's down. It is impossible when it's down to be able to get all 3 back up again. So thanks to Mark and Susanna Mitten for putting these together. Another natural illusion or element that I remember very well was Dad taking me to a location in New York City's Grand Central location. And there's a popular restaurant there. It was open when he showed it to me. It closed for a while. It's been open again, called the Oyster Bar. And in fact, there is something that's called a whispering gallery. You can't see it precisely, but there are 4 corners to the whispering gallery. And someone who stands in the corner where the young man, where the white t-shirt is, if you go to the exact opposite corner, you can actually turn so you're facing back to back, and you can talk to each other, and it's as if the person is standing next to you, speaking into your ear. And it has to do with the acoustics of the whispering gallery. So those of you who are in the New York area, if I know it's hard to travel now, you can probably find this, and you should give it a try. But I remember it was a very interesting phenomena, and one that when I had any friend coming in from out of town who I would take into New York City, we'd take the train from Hastings into New York. in the Grand Central Station, and I would take them to this to show them. What were some things in Martin Gardner's office? Well, on his desk was often Pete Hines' Soma Cube. And I should add, people might have thought that if you went to Dad's house, there were puzzles all throughout the house. That was not the case. There might have been one or two puzzles, depending upon if they were novel and someone had sent them to Dad. And so they might be in our living room where he was looking at it, often over cocktails. And then there were a couple up in his office. So the Soma Cube was one. In the back of his office, and you'll probably see it up in the corner. This was, I guess, one of Dad's muses. His friend, the magician photographer Charlie Reynolds, took this photograph of Albert Einstein, and Charlie gave a copy to Dad, and Dad kept it up on his wall. And then there were a variety of things in Dad's closet. And the one thing I just want to dwell upon is I set out a number of awards and honors over the years that were presented to Dad. And whereas some people might have had an awards wall, a memories wall, something that they would prominently display in their office, that was not in Dad's personality. Dad, there was a box in one of his closets next to his office where Dad kept these as mementos, but he certainly was not one to show off. Dad's literary heroes, I often, of the ones that I heard him talk about, William James, G.K. Chesterton, L. Frank Baum. The first book that I remember Dad reading to me was The Wizard of Oz. And then the first chapter book that I read was Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. And early on started reading the Oz books. And certainly then Lewis Carroll, four of Dad's favorite authors. And so now I'm going to finish with just some of my favorite photos of Dad's, and then we'll have some time for some questions. This is a very early photo of Dad that I came across, and in trying to determine why this was taken, I never was able to talk to Dad about this photo. And we think that early on in Dad's career, Dad seriously thought about becoming a professional magician. He was, at the time, as I understand it, one of the top close-up magicians in the world. I think very much in association with his time at when he was a student at the University of Chicago, and then was living in Chicago and part of the Chicago area magic crowd, of which Jay Marshall was one of his close friends. But I found this very interesting. My son William is an aspiring actor, and I came across one of his headshots. I darkened the eyes a little bit, but I find it very, very interesting to see how close my dad, when he was likely the age of my son William, in his middle 20s or so, resemble one another. Early, nice whimsical shot of Dad that was probably in sometime in the 40s. I believe this might have been shot um, sometime in the early 60s when we were living at 10 Euclid Avenue. I think that might be in the corner of his office, but it could have been when we were still living in Greenwich Village. This is one of my more favorite photos of Dad. Here's one with some of the Central Park Alice in Wonderland sculpture characters in the background. I have always enjoyed this one very much. It's a very reflective, just that slight little whimsical grin of Dad's. And it was shot through a couple visual illusions of Dad, but I've always enjoyed that one. This was another one where a variety of different illusions and items that that individuals had sent to Dad. One includes a Klein bottle. You can actually see kind of down on the floor. There's that that same highball glass, the illusion, a classic visual illusion of is it a rabbit or is it a duck that someone made out of ceramics? By far, this is absolutely my favorite photo of Dad's. And whenever I am asked to provide a photo that might go into an article or possibly some publication of Dad's, this is the first one that I go to because it is just a marvelous photo of Dad's. Of course, there are other ones. Dad very frequently, when he had some spare time, would step back and use some of his powers to levitate spoons. He liked to practice that because if you go a certain period of time, it's much more challenging to be able to get the spoon to stay stationary. It tends to wobble when it's in space. And also the same sort of thing with cards. Cards are a little harder to keep suspended because air tends to make them wobble a little bit also. And then finally, this was a picture shot in Dobbs Ferry sometime probably between, I'm going to say about 1957 or 1958. That is me on the left. That's my mother, Charlotte, my younger brother, Tom, and Dad. So with that, I am going to leave you with one interesting thought. I think that Dad, and it was just starting, but I think Dad would certainly, in the serious side, express sincere and serious concern over how elements of self-publishing and social media have taken over the ability of people who are misrepresenting information or presenting things that he would call a hoax, but trying to claim that they are absolutely serious. I think that would be very challenging for him to address, especially because he really never spent as much time on the internet other than maybe about the last 5-6 years of his life, where he spent most of his time just going up to go to Wikipedia and maybe one other online encyclopedia. So with that, Rebecca, he actually, he did have a pretty strict schedule. And I think a lot of that had to do with, for the 25 years that he wrote for Scientific American, took a large amount of time for him to stay up on the columns. And he always tried to stay, 2 or 3 columns ahead of one another. But he once remarked that during his years that he was in the United States Navy during World War II, he got to travel and see certain places in Europe and other places that he was on a ship, the SS Pope, which was a destroyer escort. He did not have that much of an interest to travel. So the traveling that I remember that he might do would be in New York State. The magic shop, magic store, Lieutenants would have a magic convention every year or so. And I remember that we would go to the hotel/resort for that. But maybe he and my mother, it wasn't until the last few years of his life, they might go out when mom would go antiquing and he would look at bookstores, but he was not a large traveler. Gordon, I do not know. At the time, or in a lot of Dad's columns, that artwork was done specifically for Scientific American and the resolution of newspaper publications. And then they were reprinted mostly in black and white, or those that they used when they reprinted his columns in books. I do not know if they're going to redo the art. That would be interesting, because if they did, I only know enough to be dangerous about copyright law. If they were going to reproduce the diagrams almost precisely as they appeared, they would probably need to get some form of copyright permission from the original artists. And I'm not saying that could or could not be done, but I can see your understanding. Who was Dad's favorite magician? That's a really interesting question, because I don't recollect Dad ever talking about specific magicians other than magician friends like Di Vernon, Clayton Rawson. There was a close-up magician, and one of my learning disabilities is when I have to retrieve a name, I can't. I know the last name of this magician was Dorney. I know that Dad thanks Dorney in his encyclopedia of impromptu magic as having a strong impact on him. So I think Dad liked many magicians. James Randi, certainly. I don't know if he ever really had a favorite. So, I never met Ricky Jay. I know that, well, I am not certain, but I would guess that when Ricky Jay was younger, Dad would have met Ricky as part of the New York City magic crowd. I know that Dad and Ricky Jay corresponded, and I know that in at least one, possibly two of the books that Ricky J wrote, Ricky made it a point to send Dad an autographed copy. And yes, Dad and Raymond Smullyan corresponded quite a bit over the years. He also often talked to Dad on the telephone. I almost invariably in the 2 to 4 hours that I would spend visiting with Dad on Sundays, the phone would ring, and it would be someone like James Randi, someone like Raymond Smullyan. It might have been CoM Mulcahy. I know CoM visited Dad a variety of times. And so Dad spoke frequently with people over the telephone. Most of the time they would call him. Dad was less to call on other individuals. He would not call, but he would write a letter. I remember one time he had a question about something having to do with either his medication or his health. And rather than call his doctor, and his doctor was also my doctor, he sent his doctor a letter. And I remember when I was in chatting with my doctor, he mentioned, "I got a letter from your dad." and he was just kind of tickled that Dad would do that. But that's how Dad would. That was very old school. And I forgot to mention, in Dad's schedule, I showed with you his daily schedule earlier. I believe that Thursdays was Dad's correspondence day. So Dad devoted the entire Thursday of the week to just doing his correspondence with individual. And this correspondence might be dialogue about some information he was gathering for one of his mathematical games columns. It might be discussion of a magic trick. He might be writing a letter to one of his magician friends saying, "I just saw an interesting version of this particular deck cut, and I wanted to share it with you." So Dad certainly did the bulk of his correspondence or communication with other individuals was via letters. And I also remember that of the few times Dad was out of town, it was because he would have taken the train in to New York City to go to the New York City Library, where he would be doing research on various topics.
Jim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time, sharing both your insights and the photos and the anecdotes. So much more than you can get from reading his old columns or even his books. It's just been a lot of fun to hear you share that. And I think you're right. I think he would be very dismayed if he saw what was going on today in social media. It's quite disappointing, but
yeah, I would not be surprised if by now Dad would have written a letter to the editor or some sort of column on the issues of social media or other misinformation that is occurring, at least in my opinion. I can't speak for Dad other than I'm pretty certain he would agree that that misinformation is rampant with social media.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, and I'll leave it at that.
I think if he'd been around, he would have certainly been in one of the subjects in the social dilemma, because his prominence would have been certainly appreciated. Well, thanks again, and it's been my pleasure and an honor to both meet you and
it was a
help host this
pleasure.
for you.
I always enjoy the ability to share some of my recollections about Dad.
Great.
Take care,
Okay.
everyone.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.